It was dawn on September 12, 1683. The walls of Vienna lay in ruins. Massive sections of stone fortification that had stood for centuries were now nothing more than piles of rubble and dust. The city had been under siege for 2 months, 60 days of relentless bombardment, constant assault, starvation, and death. Within the shattered fortifications, the exhausted defenders gazed at the horizon with a mixture of despair and hope. They had held on far longer than anyone thought possible. 15,000 soldiers and armed citizens against the largest invasion force Europe had ever seen. But they were at their breaking point. Food was almost gone. Ammunition was running low. The wounded lay in makeshift hospitals with no medicine to ease their pain. On the other side of those crumbling walls, the largest army the Ottoman Empire had ever assembled in Europe prepared for what they believed would be the final assault. 200,000 men armed to the teeth stretched across the landscape as far as the eye could see. Their cannons had reduced the city's defenses to rubble. Their siege tunnels had collapsed entire sections of wall. Their determination to finally conquer the jewel of Central Europe was absolute. Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa Pasha was confident. Victory seemed inevitable. His janissaries, the elite Ottoman infantry, were ready. His Sipahi cavalry was positioned. His artillery crews had their orders. Within hours, perhaps even minutes, the Ottoman flag would fly over Vienna. The gateway to Western Europe would be open. Nothing would stop the Sultan's armies from marching on Germany, France, and beyond. But something was about to happen that would completely change the course of European history. Something that Kara Mustafa, for all his military experience and confidence, had not anticipated. Something that was, at that very moment, approaching from the hills to the north. A secret weapon was coming. A force so powerful, so devastating, that it would turn what should have been the greatest Ottoman victory into one of the most catastrophic defeats any empire had ever suffered. This weapon would break the back of Ottoman expansion. It would save Vienna, save Austria, and arguably save Western European civilization as we know it, and the Ottomans had no idea what was coming. To understand what made the Battle of Vienna so significant, we need to go back and understand just how dominant the Ottoman Empire was in 1683. This wasn't just another powerful kingdom. This was a superpower that had been expanding for over 2 centuries, conquering territory on 3 continents and striking fear into the hearts of European monarchs since the fall of Constantinople in 1453, that legendary siege where the Ottomans brought down the last remnant of the Roman Empire, the Sultans. Armies had been virtually unstoppable. They controlled the Middle East, North Africa, and the entire Balkan Peninsula. They had pushed deep into Central Europe, conquering Hungary and threatening Austria itself. Every Ottoman Sultan dreamed of taking Vienna. The city wasn't just another conquest, it was a symbol. Vienna was considered the gateway to the heart of Western Europe. It was the capital of the Habsburg Empire, one of the few Christian powers still standing against Ottoman expansion. If Vienna fell, the psychological and strategic consequences would be catastrophic. The road to Germany would be open. France would be threatened. The entire balance of power in Europe would shift. The Habsburg Empire, which controlled Austria and much of Central Europe, was in a desperate position by the early 1680s. Emperor Leopold faced threats from every direction. To the west, King Louis XIV of France, the Sun King, was constantly pressing Habsburg borders, trying to expand French territory. To the north, Protestant German princes distrusted the Catholic Austrian emperor and were reluctant to help him. And to the south and east, Ottoman power grew with each passing year. In 1681, the situation became critical. A Hungarian revolt against Habsburg rule gave the Ottomans the perfect excuse to intervene. Sultan Mehmed IV decided it was finally time to conquer Vienna, once and for all. He appointed his ambitious Grand Vizier, Kara Mustafa Pasha, to lead the campaign. Kara Mustafa was a man consumed by 2 things: glory and wealth. He saw the conquest of Vienna not just as a military victory, but as an opportunity to amass unimaginable treasures. European cities were rich, their churches filled with gold and silver, their nobles possessing vast wealth. Taking Vienna would make him one of the richest men in the world, while also securing his place in history as the conqueror of Christianity's greatest fortress. He began assembling an army unlike anything Europe had seen in generations. The call went out across the Ottoman Empire, and 200,000 men answered. This wasn't just an army. It was a migration of warriors, a flood of military power that seemed unstoppable. At the core were the Janissaries, 20,000 elite infantry troops. These were not ordinary soldiers. The Janissaries were taken as boys from Christian families, converted to Islam, and trained from childhood to be fanatical warriors, loyal only to the Sultan. They were disciplined, fearless, and utterly ruthless in combat. They formed the backbone of Ottoman military success. Then came the Sipahis, the heavy cavalry. These were warriors mounted on magnificent Arabian horses, armed with lances, curved sabers, and composite bows that could pierce armor at 200 yards. They were the shock troops of the Ottoman army, capable of breaking enemy formations with devastating charges. Beyond these elite units came provincial levies from across the empire. There were Crimean Tatars, fierce horsemen known for their speed and savagery. There were regiments from Wallachia, Moldavia, and Transylvania, vassals forced to contribute troops to the Sultan's war machine. There were tens of thousands of irregular troops, raiders and adventurers who followed the army hoping for plunder and glory. But what made this army truly terrifying was its artillery. The Ottomans had pioneered the use of gunpowder cannons in siege warfare. They brought with them 300 artillery pieces, including enormous bombards capable of launching stone projectiles weighing hundreds of kilograms. These were the same type of cannons that had demolished the walls of Constantinople 2 centuries earlier. Now they would be turned against Vienna. In the spring of 1683, this colossal army began its march. News of its approach spread terror throughout Central Europe. City after city surrendered without a fight. Those that resisted were razed to the ground, their populations massacred or enslaved. The Ottoman army advanced like a relentless flood, destroying everything in its path. By July, they reached the gates of Vienna. The defenders looked out from their walls and felt their hearts sink. The Ottoman encampment stretched beyond the horizon. Thousands of tents, hundreds of cannons, an endless sea of soldiers. The city had only about 15,000 defenders, a mix of imperial soldiers, urban militias, and volunteers. Against 200,000 invaders, the chances of victory seemed mathematically impossible. This was the Ottoman Empire at the absolute height of its power, bringing its full military might to bear on a single objective. Everything pointed to inevitable victory. The largest army, the best artillery, experienced commanders, and absolute determination. But they had made one critical miscalculation. They had assumed that Vienna stood alone. They had no idea that Europe was about to unite against them. And they certainly had no idea about the secret weapon that was being prepared in Poland. When the Ottoman army first appeared before Vienna's walls in July 1683, Emperor Leopold made a decision that shocked many in his court. He fled the city. The Habsburg ruler gathered his family, his most important courtiers, and his treasury, and left Vienna to its fate. This wasn't cowardice, it was strategy. If Leopold remained in the city and it fell, he would be captured or killed, and the Habsburg Empire would be leaderless. By escaping, he could rally support from across Europe, coordinate the relief effort, and ensure that even if Vienna fell, the war would continue. But his departure left the city's defenders feeling abandoned. Command fell to Count Ernst Rüdiger von Starhemberg, an experienced and determined soldier who had spent his entire life fighting Ottoman forces. Starhemberg understood the brutal mathematics of siege warfare. He knew that Vienna could not hold out indefinitely. His only hope was to buy time, to hold on long enough for a relief army to arrive. The siege began with a methodical Ottoman strategy. Rather than waste men in frontal assaults against defended walls, Kara Mustafa ordered his artillery to systematically pound the fortifications into rubble. Every day, hundreds of cannonballs slammed into Vienna's walls. The bombardment was constant, giving defenders no rest, wearing down both stone and human spirit. But the cannons were only part of the Ottoman siege strategy. Below ground, Ottoman engineers were executing one of the most terrifying siege tactics ever devised. They were digging tunnels beneath Vienna's walls. Teams of miners worked in shifts, excavating passages that extended dozens of meters underground, heading straight for the foundations of the city's fortifications. When a tunnel reached its target point directly beneath a section of wall, the Ottomans would pack the chamber with barrels of gunpowder, sometimes thousands of kilograms, and detonate it. The explosion would collapse the wall from below, creating a breach that assault troops could pour through. The defenders lived in constant fear of these mines. They could sometimes hear the digging beneath them, the scrape of tools on stone, the muffled voices of Ottoman miners. Starhemberg ordered countermining operations. His own engineers dug tunnels trying to intercept the Ottoman shafts, leading to bizarre underground battles fought in darkness with picks and knives. When an Ottoman mine did explode, the result was catastrophic. Entire sections of wall would suddenly collapse in clouds of dust and smoke. Buildings near the fortifications would be destroyed. Defenders would be buried alive. And then came the assault. Ottoman soldiers would rush forward trying to exploit the breach before it could be plugged. Every day there were assaults. Brutal hand-to-hand combat in the ruins of the walls. The defenders repelled each attack, but at a terrible cost. Casualties mounted. The city's hospitals overflowed with wounded men. Surgeons worked without anesthesia or proper medical supplies, amputating shattered limbs, trying desperately to save lives with medieval techniques. As the weeks passed, the situation inside Vienna became increasingly desperate. Food was running low. Starhemberg had ordered strict rationing from the beginning, but supplies that were meant to last 2 months were nearly exhausted. Citizens were eating horses, dogs, rats, anything they could find. Disease spread through the crowded city. Dysentery, typhus, and cholera killed as many people as Ottoman cannonballs. Ammunition was another critical problem. The defenders fired thousands of musket balls and cannon shot every day. Starhemberg ordered citizens to collect every piece of metal in the city that could be melted down and reformed into projectiles. Church bells, cooking pots, decorative metalwork, everything was sacrificed to the war effort. Inside the city, civilians and soldiers alike were dying of hunger and disease. Some spoke of surrender. Whispers circulated through the streets. Perhaps it would be better to surrender now, negotiate terms, save what could be saved. But Starhemberg refused to give up. He knew that relief was coming. He just needed to hold on a little longer. Every night he climbed the crumbling walls and looked west, searching for signs of a relief army. He strained his eyes looking for campfires on distant hills, for any indication that help was approaching. And every night he saw only darkness and the fires of the Ottoman camp stretching as far as the eye could see. By early September, Vienna had been under siege for 2 months. The walls were in ruins. Multiple breaches had been blown in the fortifications. The garrison was exhausted, starving, and running out of ammunition. Another week, perhaps 2 at most, and the city would fall. On the Ottoman side, Kara Mustafa was growing impatient. The siege was lasting much longer than he had planned. He had expected Vienna to fall within weeks. Now months had passed and the city still held out. His men were growing restless. Supplies were becoming an issue even for his massive army, and reports were arriving that a relief army was forming to the north. But Kara Mustafa remained confident. He had 200,000 men. Even if a relief army arrived, he could easily divide his forces, keeping half to continue the siege while using the other half to destroy the relief forces. He had faced European armies before and crushed them. Why should this time be any different? He had made a crucial mistake, however. He completely underestimated the size and composition of the force coming to Vienna's rescue. He had no idea that the relief army included something unprecedented, something that would change everything. Every day, Starhemberg's sentries watched the horizon with desperate hope, and finally on September 8th they saw it, fires on the distant hills to the northwest. Not Ottoman fires, different, organized, moving. The relief army had arrived. Inside Vienna, the news spread like wildfire. Church bells rang, the few that hadn't been melted down for ammunition. Citizens wept with relief. Soldiers who had been ready to collapse found new strength. They just had to hold on a few more days. Help was here, but would it be enough? Could any relief force break through 200,000 Ottoman soldiers? The defenders didn't know. They could only hope, pray, and keep fighting. While Vienna was slowly being strangled by the Ottoman siege, a different kind of battle was being fought hundreds of miles away. This battle wasn't fought with cannons and swords, but with letters, diplomats, and desperate appeals. And the man leading this diplomatic war was Pope Innocent XIII. The Pope saw the siege of Vienna not just as a political crisis, but as an existential threat to Christianity itself. If Vienna fell, the Ottoman Empire would dominate Central Europe. The Protestant German states would be isolated. The Catholic Habsburg Empire would be crippled. The balance of power that had maintained European independence would be shattered. But convincing Europe to unite against this threat was incredibly difficult. Europe in 1683 was fragmented by deep divisions. Catholics and Protestants had been massacring each other for over a century in the wars of religion. The German states were a patchwork of competing principalities that spent more time fighting each other than cooperating. France, under Louis XIV, was actually allied with the Ottomans against the Habsburgs because of European power politics. Pope Innocent XV began a frantic diplomatic campaign. He sent emissaries to every Catholic court in Europe. He wrote personal letters to kings and princes. He offered money, religious dispensations, promises of political support, anything that might convince them to come to Vienna's aid. His message was simple but powerful. If Vienna falls, all of Christendom will be in danger. This is not just Austria's war. This is everyone's war. Slowly, his message began to resonate. The first to respond was John Sobieski, the King of Poland. And this is where our story's hero enters. John Sobieski was one of the greatest military commanders of his time. Born in 1629 into Polish nobility, he had spent his entire life fighting. As a young man, he fought against Swedish invaders during the Deluge, the devastating war that nearly destroyed Poland. Then he turned his attention east, where he spent decades battling Ottoman forces and their Crimean Tatar allies in the Ukrainian steppes. Sobieski understood the Ottomans better than almost any European commander. He knew their tactics, their strengths, and their weaknesses. He had fought them in dozens of battles and had learned to respect their military capabilities, while also understanding how to defeat them. Most importantly, he was unafraid of them. While other European commanders were intimidated by Ottoman military reputation, Sobieski saw them as a solvable tactical problem. When the Pope's call for help reached Poland, Sobieski saw an opportunity, not just to save Christendom, but to cover Poland with glory and secure Polish influence in European affairs. He immediately began mobilizing his army. And this is where the secret weapon enters our story. The Polish army possessed something no other European army had in such quantity or quality: heavy cavalry known as the Winged Hussars. These units were the elite of the elite, warriors who had evolved over centuries of constant warfare on Europe's eastern borders. Sobieski began assembling the largest force of Winged Hussars ever gathered in one place. He sent word throughout Poland, calling every Hussar regiment to join him. From noble estates across the kingdom, these elite warriors answered the call. By August, he had assembled an army of 30,000 men, including 18,000 heavy cavalry, the core of which were the legendary Winged Hussars. But Sobieski wasn't coming alone. Responding to the Pope's appeals, German princes began contributing troops. Charles V, Duke of Lorraine, brought an imperial army of 20,000 men. He had been fighting the Ottomans all summer, conducting a guerrilla campaign to slow their advance toward Vienna. Now he would join the main relief force. John George III, Elector of Saxony, sent troops despite being Protestant. The Ottoman threat transcended religious divisions. Maximilian II, Emmanuel, Elector of Bavaria, came with Bavarian regiments. Even small German principalities sent what they could. A few hundred men here, a regiment there. Every contribution mattered. By early September, these forces had gathered in the hills north of Vienna. The relief army totaled about 70,000 men. This was less than half the size of the Ottoman force, but it was united by a common purpose and led by one of Europe's greatest commanders. The army was diverse. There were Polish cavalry and German infantry, Austrian veterans and Bavarian recruits, Saxon gunners and Lorraine scouts. They spoke different languages, followed different military traditions, and had different reasons for being there. But they all understood what was at stake. On September 8th, the relief army began its final march toward Vienna. They moved through the Vienna woods, rugged forested terrain that made progress slow and difficult. The forest provided cover, preventing the Ottomans from seeing exactly where they were or how strong they were. But it also meant that bringing artillery and supplies forward was brutally difficult. The Ottomans knew a relief force was coming, but due to the terrain, they couldn't determine its exact size or composition. Kara Mustafa faced a critical decision. Should he lift the siege and move his entire army into a defensive position to face the relief force? Or should he divide his forces, keeping part of the army besieging Vienna while using the rest to block the relief attempt? He made his second crucial mistake. He decided to divide his forces. He kept most of his army occupied with the siege and sent only a blocking force to deal with what he assumed was a relatively small relief army. This decision would prove catastrophic. As the relief army emerged from the Vienna woods and took position on the heights north of the city, both sides could finally see each other clearly. On the Ottoman side, there was confusion and growing concern. The relief army was much larger than expected, and on the right flank, gleaming in the afternoon sun of September 11th, were ranks upon ranks of armored cavalry. Wings rose from their backs, their lances pointed skyward like a steel forest. 18,000 heavy horsemen, the largest elite cavalry force assembled in a single place since the Crusades. The secret weapon had arrived. Now we finally reveal the secret weapon that would change everything. The Polish Winged Hussars. But to understand why they were so devastating, we need to understand exactly what made them different from every other cavalry force in Europe. The Winged Hussars were not just ordinary cavalry. They were the result of centuries of military evolution, refined through constant warfare on Europe's eastern frontier, where Polish forces faced enemies ranging from Tatar raiders to Ottoman armies to Russian invaders. Each Winged Hussar was a Polish nobleman, a member of the warrior aristocracy known as the Szlachta. In Polish society, nobility wasn't rare. Roughly 10% of the population were nobles, but true Winged Hussars came from the elite of this class. These were families with military traditions going back generations, families that had produced warriors for centuries. Training began in childhood. A noble boy destined to become a hussar learned to ride before he could walk properly. By age 5, he was on horseback daily. By age 10, he was learning weapon techniques. By 15, he was practicing lance charges and formation riding. By 20, a Winged Hussar was a mounted killing machine with 15 years of intensive training. But what made the Hussars truly unique was their equipment. This wasn't standard European cavalry gear. Every piece was specifically designed and refined over decades of battlefield experience. Each hussar wore a full suit of armor, but not the heavy Gothic plate armor of medieval Western knights. That style was already obsolete by 1683, too heavy, too restrictive, vulnerable to firearms. Instead, hussars wore Eastern-style armor made of overlapping steel plates. This offered exceptional protection against sabers, arrows, and even musket balls at longer ranges, while remaining light enough not to exhaust the horse. Over the armor, they wore animal skins, leopard, tiger, or lion pelts. This wasn't decoration. The pelts provided additional protection against slashing weapons. A saber that might catch and pierce cloth or leather would slide off the slick fur. It was functional combat gear that happened to look terrifying. And then there were the wings, large wooden frames covered with eagle feathers attached to the saddle or to a special harness on the hussar's back. These wings served multiple purposes. When the hussar galloped at full speed, the wings created a terrifying whistling sound, a psychological weapon designed to break enemy morale before the impact. The wings also made the hussar appear larger, more imposing, almost supernatural, and practically, they provided some protection against lasso attacks, a common Tatar tactic. The Winged Hussar's primary weapon was the kopia, a hollow wooden lance approximately 6 meters long. This wasn't like Western European lances. Western knights held their lances tucked firmly under the arm, using the horse's momentum to drive the point forward in a single, devastating collision. The lance would shatter on impact, and the knight would draw his sword for close combat. The kopia worked differently. It was held balanced in the hand, allowing the rider to use it more like a long thrusting pike. This technique meant a skilled hussar could thrust the lance through one enemy, withdraw it, and immediately thrust it into another enemy, all in a single charge. The kopia could be used multiple times before breaking, making each hussar far more deadly than a Western knight with a single-use lance. When the lance finally did break, the hussar had backup weapons. Each carried multiple sabers, razor-sharp curved swords capable of severing a limb or head with a single blow. They also carried warhammers for dealing with heavily armored opponents, and many carried pistols or carbines for ranged combat, though firearms were considered secondary weapons. But the Hussars' true strength wasn't in their equipment or individual training. It was in their discipline and tactics. This is what separated them from virtually every other cavalry force in the world. Most cavalry of the era, Ottoman Sipahis, French cavalry, even other European heavy cavalry, charged in relatively disorderly formations. Individual warriors would race forward seeking personal glory, resulting in a chaotic melee that often accomplished little strategic value. The Winged Hussars attacked in perfect formation. They charged in tight ranks, knee to knee, maintaining formation discipline even at full gallop. They attacked in successive waves. The first line struck the enemy like a hammer, breaking the formation with their lances. Then, before the enemy could recover, the second line passed through the gaps, exploiting the breaches. Then the third line, then the fourth. It was a perfectly coordinated killing machine. Each wave amplified the damage of the previous one. Each charge was timed to maximize psychological and physical destruction. The Hussars could destroy entire armies in minutes using this tactic. The Ottomans had heard of the Hussars, of course. Polish cavalry had fought Ottoman forces before, but they had never faced the Winged Hussars in their full power, 18,000 of them charging down a mountain in perfect formation over ideal terrain. They had absolutely no idea what was coming. Let's talk about numbers for a moment to understand the scale. 18,000 heavy cavalry was an enormous force. For comparison, at the Battle of Waterloo over a century later, one of history's most famous battles, Napoleon had only about 15,000 cavalry in total, including light cavalry, dragoons, and heavy cuirassiers. The Polish force at Vienna was larger than that and composed entirely of elite heavy cavalry. In medieval battles, a few hundred heavy cavalry could turn the tide of battle. A charge by 200 or 300 armored knights could break an infantry formation and cause an army to rout. At Vienna, there were 18,000 of these warriors, all elite, all with identical training, all moving as one unified force. This wasn't just a cavalry unit. This was a strategic weapon, the equivalent of a panzer division or a modern armored brigade. Nothing in the Ottoman military experience had prepared them for what was about to happen. Sobieski had spent his entire military career perfecting the use of heavy cavalry. He understood better than any commander in Europe exactly how to employ this weapon for maximum effect. He knew the terrain they needed, the timing that was required, the formation discipline that was essential, and as he looked down from Kahlenberg Hill on the evening of September 11th, he knew that everything was perfect. The terrain sloped down in a long, relatively gentle grade toward the Ottoman lines, perfect for building cavalry speed without losing control. The ground was firm enough for horses to gallop at full speed without sinking. There were no major obstacles, no hedges or ditches that would break up the formation. The Ottomans were positioned on low ground with their backs to the Danube River, giving them nowhere to retreat. It was the ideal tactical situation. Sobieski gave the order they would attack at dawn, and when they did, they would unleash the most devastating cavalry charge in military history. The night of September 11th to 12th, 1683, was filled with tension. Both sides knew that the next day would be decisive. The fate of Vienna, perhaps of all Europe, would be determined in the battle to come. On the Christian lines, stretching across the heights north of Vienna, soldiers made their final preparations. Priests moved through the camps hearing confessions and blessing the men. Many soldiers wrote final letters to their families, knowing they might not survive the next day. Weapons were sharpened, armor was checked, horses were fed and watered. On the Ottoman lines below, imams led prayers. Kara Mustafa held war councils with his commanders, discussing strategy and positioning. But there was growing unease in the Ottoman camp. Their scouts had finally gotten close enough to assess the relief army's size and composition. The reports were troubling. The force was larger than expected, and that mass of cavalry on the enemy's right flank looked unlike anything they had encountered before. Kara Mustafa was worried now. He had divided his forces, keeping a substantial portion focused on Vienna while positioning the rest to face the relief army. In retrospect, this was clearly a mistake. He should have either committed fully to taking Vienna before the relief army arrived, or lifted the siege entirely and positioned his whole army in a strong defensive position. Instead, he had done neither, leaving himself vulnerable on two fronts. But it was too late to change strategy now. The relief army was here. Battle would be joined at dawn. He ordered his men to prepare defensive positions and ready themselves to receive the attack. Inside Vienna, Starhemberg had heard the distant sounds of armies gathering to the north. He understood what was happening. The relief force had arrived. Now he needed to support them by attacking from inside the city, preventing Kara Mustafa from withdrawing troops to reinforce against the relief army. He gathered his exhausted, starving garrison and gave them their orders. When the battle began tomorrow, they would sally forth from the city gates and attack the Ottoman siege lines from behind. It would be dangerous, possibly suicidal, but it was necessary. After 2 months of desperate defense, they would finally go on the offense. As night fell, Sobieski climbed to a high point on Kahlenberg Hill. From here, he could see the entire battlefield spread out below him. The Ottoman army stretched across the landscape, their campfires like stars scattered across the ground. Vienna itself was visible in the distance, its walls barely standing, smoke rising from fires within the city. Sobieski studied the terrain with an expert's eye. He had been planning this attack for days, ever since the relief army had emerged from the Vienna woods. Now he confirmed what he had already assessed. The ground was perfect for his purposes. The slope from Kahlenberg Hill down toward the Ottoman left flank was about 4 kilometers, long with a gradual decline. This was ideal for cavalry. Too steep and horses would stumble and lose control. Too flat, and they wouldn't build enough speed for a devastating impact. But this slope was perfect. His hussars could start at a walk, build to a trot, then shift to a canter, and finally reach full gallop just as they struck the enemy lines. Gravity would be his ally. The descending charge would add tremendous force to the impact. The horses would be running downhill with momentum behind them, making each lance thrust even more powerful, each collision even more devastating. The Ottoman left flank, the part of their army that would receive the hussar charge, was positioned on relatively open ground. There were no major obstacles, no fortifications, no terrain features that could break up his formation. Once his hussars built speed, nothing would stop them until they crashed into the Ottoman lines. And behind the Ottomans was the Danube River. If their line broke, they would be trapped against the river with no escape route. This was a catastrophic defensive position, but Kara Mustafa had chosen it because it allowed him to keep one arm of his army focused on Vienna, while facing the relief force with the other. It was a fatal compromise. Sobieski divided his forces strategically. The German and Austrian troops under the Duke of Lorraine would form the center and left of the attack. They would advance first, engaging the Ottoman center and right, fixing them in place and preventing them from reinforcing the left flank. Meanwhile, Sobieski would hold his cavalry, especially his precious winged hussars, in reserve on the right. He would wait, watching the battle develop, calculating the exact moment when the Ottoman line was most vulnerable. And then, at precisely the right time, he would unleash his secret weapon. This required enormous discipline and patience. Every warrior wants to fight. Sitting in reserve while comrades are dying in battle is psychologically difficult, but Sobieski understood tactical timing better than perhaps any commander of his era. He knew that charging too early, before the enemy was committed and vulnerable, would waste his greatest asset. He had to wait for the perfect moment. His commanders understood this too. The hussar regiments were positioned on the right flank, visible to the Ottoman forces below. The sight of them alone was psychological warfare. Ottoman soldiers looking up at those ranks of winged cavalry felt fear stirring in their chests. As the night wore on, both sides tried to rest, knowing that the morning would bring blood and death on a massive scale. Few slept well. In the Ottoman camp, soldiers checked their weapons and wondered what those winged horsemen on the hilltop would be like to face in battle. In the Christian camp, men prayed and thought of home. Sobieski spent much of the night in prayer. He was deeply religious and saw this battle not just as a military campaign but as a holy war. Before the charge, he would kneel and pray for divine protection. For him and his men, they were not just fighting for Vienna or for Poland. They were fighting for Christianity itself. The hours crept by slowly. Midnight passed. The early morning hours dragged. Soldiers shivered in the cold air, waiting for dawn. And then finally the eastern horizon began to lighten. The sun was rising on September 12, 1683. The day of destiny had arrived. Dawn broke cold and foggy on September 12th. At first light, the relief army began to move. The moment everyone had been waiting for had arrived. The Germans and Austrians in the center and left began their advance at 8 in the morning. Infantry regiments marched down from the hills in formation. Cavalry units moved to protect their flanks. Artillery crews prepared their cannons, positioning them to provide covering fire. The Ottomans responded immediately. Their artillery, which had been pounding Vienna for 2 months, was rapidly repositioned to face this new threat. Cannonballs began to fly. The roar of artillery echoed across the battlefield. The battle had begun. The German and Austrian forces advanced methodically. They knew their role was to fix the Ottoman center and right in place, to prevent Kara Mustafa from shifting troops to reinforce against the coming cavalry assault. It was bloody, difficult work. Ottoman Janissaries were elite troops who fought with discipline and courage. They held their defensive positions, firing muskets in coordinated volleys, launching counterattacks against the advancing Christians. Meanwhile, inside Vienna, Starhemberg gave his order. The city gates opened and the garrison streamed out. Thousands of desperate, starving, exhausted men who found the strength to attack one more time. They fell on the Ottoman siege lines from behind, attacking the soldiers who had been tormenting them for 2 months. The fighting was savage, close-quarters combat with no quarter given. Kara Mustafa now found himself fighting on 2 fronts simultaneously, exactly the situation he had tried to avoid. His carefully laid plans were unraveling. He sent messengers racing across the battlefield with new orders, trying to coordinate a defense against threats from multiple directions. Throughout the morning and into the afternoon, the battle intensified. The German and Austrian units clashed repeatedly with Ottoman defensive lines. Progress was slow and measured in meters, paid for with blood. For hours, the outcome remained genuinely uncertain. The Ottoman center was holding. The Janissaries fought fiercely, repelling assault after assault. The night of September 11th to 12th, 1683, was filled with tension. Both sides knew that the next day would be decisive. The fate of Vienna, perhaps of all Europe, would be determined in the battle to come. On the Christian lines, stretching across the heights north of Vienna, soldiers made their final preparations. Priests moved through the camps, hearing confessions and blessing the men. Many soldiers wrote final letters to their families, knowing they might not survive the next day. Weapons were sharpened, armor was checked, horses were fed and watered. On the Ottoman lines below, imams led prayers. Kara Mustafa held war councils with his commanders, discussing strategy and positioning. But there was growing unease in the Ottoman camp. Their scouts had finally gotten close enough to assess the relief army's size and composition. The reports were troubling. The force was larger than expected, and that mass of cavalry on the enemy's right flank looked unlike anything they had encountered before. Kara Mustafa was worried now. He had divided his forces, keeping a substantial portion focused on Vienna, while positioning the rest to face the relief army. In retrospect, this was clearly a mistake. He should have either committed fully to taking Vienna before the relief army arrived, or lifted the siege entirely and positioned his whole army in a strong defensive position. Instead, he had done neither, leaving himself vulnerable on 2 fronts. But it was too late to change strategy now. The relief army was here. Battle would be joined at dawn. He ordered his men to prepare defensive positions and ready themselves to receive the attack. Inside Vienna, Starhemberg had heard the distant sounds of armies gathering to the north. He understood what was happening. The relief force had arrived. Now he needed to support them by attacking from inside the city, preventing Kara Mustafa from withdrawing troops to reinforce against the relief army. He gathered his exhausted, starving garrison and gave them their orders. When the battle began tomorrow, they would sally forth from the city gates and attack the Ottoman siege lines from behind. It would be dangerous, possibly suicidal, but it was necessary. After 2 months of desperate defense, they would finally go on the offense. As night fell, Sobieski climbed to a high point on Kahlenberg Hill. From here, he could see the entire battlefield spread out below him. The Ottoman army stretched across the landscape, their campfires like stars scattered across the ground. Vienna itself was visible in the distance, its walls barely standing, smoke rising from fires within the city. Sobieski studied the terrain with an expert's eye. He had been planning this attack for days, ever since the relief army had emerged from the Vienna woods, now he confirmed. What he had already assessed, the ground was perfect for his purposes. The slope from Kahlenberg Hill down toward the Ottoman left flank was about 4 kilometers, long with a gradual decline. This was ideal for cavalry. Too steep and horses would stumble and lose control. Too flat and they wouldn't build enough speed for a devastating impact. But this slope was perfect. His hussars could start at a walk, build to a trot, then shift to a canter and finally reach full gallop just as they struck the enemy lines. Gravity would be his ally. The descending charge would add tremendous force to the impact. The horses would be running downhill with momentum behind them, making each lance thrust even more powerful, each collision even more devastating. The Ottoman left flank, the part of their army that would receive the hussar charge, was positioned on relatively open ground. There were no major obstacles, no fortifications, no terrain features that could break up his formation. Once his hussars built speed, nothing would stop them until they crashed into the Ottoman lines. And behind the Ottomans was the Danube River. If their line broke, they would be trapped against the river with no escape route. This was a catastrophic defensive position, but Kara Mustafa had chosen it because it allowed him to keep one arm of his army focused on Vienna while facing the relief force with the other. It was a fatal compromise. Sobieski divided his forces strategically. The German and Austrian troops under the Duke of Lorraine would form the center and left of the attack. They would advance first, engaging the Ottoman center and right, fixing them in place and preventing them from reinforcing the left flank. Meanwhile, Sobieski would hold his cavalry, especially his precious winged hussars, in reserve on the right. He would wait, watching the battle develop, calculating the exact moment when the Ottoman line was most vulnerable. And then, at precisely the right time, he would unleash his secret weapon. This required enormous discipline and patience. Every warrior wants to fight. Sitting in reserve while comrades are dying in battle is psychologically difficult. But Sobieski understood tactical timing better than perhaps any commander of his era. He knew that charging too early, before the enemy was committed and vulnerable, would waste his greatest asset. He had to wait for the perfect moment. His commanders understood this too. The hussar regiments were positioned on the right flank, visible to the Ottoman forces below. The sight of them alone was psychological warfare. Ottoman soldiers looking up at those ranks of winged cavalry felt fear stirring in their chests. As the night wore on, both sides tried to rest, knowing that the morning would bring blood and death on a massive scale. Few slept well. In the Ottoman camp, soldiers checked their weapons and wondered what those winged horsemen on the hilltop would be like to face in battle. In the Christian camp, men prayed and thought of home. Sobieski spent much of the night in prayer. He was deeply religious and saw this battle not just as a military campaign but as a holy war. Before the charge, he would kneel and pray for divine protection. For him and his men, they were not just fighting for Vienna or for Poland. They were fighting for Christianity itself. The hours crept by slowly. Midnight passed. The early morning hours dragged. Soldiers shivered in the cold air waiting for dawn. And then finally the eastern horizon began to lighten. The sun was rising on September 12, 1683. The day of destiny had arrived. Dawn broke cold and foggy on September 12th. At first light, the relief army began to move. The moment everyone had been waiting for had arrived. The Germans and Austrians in the center and left began their advance at 8 in the morning. Infantry regiments marched down from the hills in formation. Cavalry units moved to protect their flanks. Artillery crews prepared their cannons, positioning them to provide covering fire. The Ottomans responded immediately. Their artillery, which had been pounding Vienna for 2 months, was rapidly repositioned to face this new threat. Cannonballs began to fly. The roar of artillery echoed across the battlefield. The battle had begun. The German and Austrian forces advanced methodically. They knew their role was to fix the Ottoman center and right in place, to prevent Kara Mustafa from shifting troops to reinforce against the coming cavalry assault. It was bloody, difficult work. Ottoman janissaries were elite troops who fought with discipline and courage. They held their defensive positions, firing muskets in coordinated volleys, launching counterattacks against the advancing Christians. Meanwhile, inside Vienna, Starhemberg gave his order. The city gates opened and the garrison streamed out. Thousands of desperate, starving, exhausted men who found the strength to attack one more time. They fell on the Ottoman siege lines from behind, attacking the soldiers who had been tormenting them for 2 months. The fighting was savage, close-quarters combat with no quarter given. Kara Mustafa now found himself fighting on 2 fronts simultaneously, exactly the situation he had tried to avoid. His carefully laid plans were unraveling. He sent messengers racing across the battlefield with new orders, trying to coordinate a defense against threats from multiple directions. Throughout the morning and into the afternoon, the battle intensified. The German and Austrian units clashed repeatedly with Ottoman defensive lines. Progress was slow and measured in meters, paid for with blood. For hours the outcome remained genuinely uncertain. The Ottoman center was holding. The Janissaries fought fiercely, repelling assault after assault. If the Ottomans could hold until nightfall, they could reorganize, bring up reserves, and continue the battle the next day. They might even still win. Everything hung in the balance, and on the right flank, John Sobieski waited. He sat on his horse at the head of his hussar regiments, watching the battle unfold before him. He was calculating, analyzing, waiting for the exact right moment. His commanders grew restless. Some suggested charging immediately, but Sobieski held firm. Not yet. Not yet. He was waiting for specific conditions. He needed the Ottoman center to be fully engaged, their reserves committed, their attention divided. He needed the Ottoman left flank, the part of the army directly below his position, to show signs of stress. He needed the sun to be in the right position, so it would be in the Ottomans' eyes as they looked up at the charging cavalry. Every detail mattered. Around 3 o'clock in the afternoon, Sobieski saw what he was looking for. The Ottoman center was fully engaged in brutal combat with the German forces. Their reserves had been committed to stopping the Austrian advance, and the Ottoman left flank was beginning to falter under sustained pressure. Troops were being pulled from the left to reinforce the center, creating weak points in their defensive line. The moment had arrived. Sobieski gave the order. Trumpets sounded across the Polish position. 18,000 horsemen began to move, checking their equipment one final time. They formed into lines, regiment after regiment, stretching over a mile wide. It was the largest cavalry formation assembled in Europe in over a century, perhaps ever. Sobieski rode along the formation, inspecting his men. He looked into their eyes. These were the finest warriors Poland had ever produced, and they were about to face the test of their lives. Then he took his position at the very front of the first line. The King of Poland would personally lead the charge. He would be the first to hit the enemy lines. He raised his sword high. Along the mile-wide formation, 18,000 lances lifted toward the sky. The wings of the hussars whispered in the wind, creating an eerie musical sound that carried across the battlefield. Ottoman soldiers on the left flank looked up and saw the hilltop suddenly come alive with movement. Sobieski lowered his sword, pointing it at the enemy below. 18,000 horsemen began to move, first at a walk. The formation moved forward in perfect order, knee to knee, maintaining strict discipline. The ground began to slope downward. The pace increased to a trot. The whisper of wings grew louder. The rumble of hooves began to shake the earth. The slope grew steeper. The pace increased to a canter. Now the ground truly shook. 60,000 hooves pounding against the earth created a sound like continuous thunder. The wings created a roaring whistle that grew louder with each second. And then, as the slope reached its optimal angle, the formation reached full gallop. 18,000 horses running at maximum speed. 18,000 armored warriors with lances lowered. The sound was overwhelming, like a storm, like an earthquake, like the end of the world. The Ottomans on the left flank looked up and saw an avalanche of steel and fury descending upon them. The sight was beyond anything they had experienced in their military careers. The ground shook so hard that men lost their footing. The sound was deafening. The visual image of that mass of armored horsemen with wings spread, charging down the mountainside at full speed, was utterly terrifying. Many Ottoman soldiers simply broke and ran before the impact even occurred. Their instincts overwhelmed their discipline. They threw down their weapons and fled, seeking any escape from what was coming. But most had nowhere to run. The Danube was at their backs. The only direction to flee was into their own troops, spreading panic. Those who remained in position, who tried to stand and fight, faced hell on earth. The first line of hussars struck the Ottoman left flank like a meteor impact. 6-meter lances driven by horses running at 40 kilometers per hour. down a slope pierced through armor, through bodies, through shields, sometimes through multiple men in a single thrust. The force of impact was devastating. Men were simply swept away, trampled, crushed. Horses crashed through infantry formations like they weren't there. The hollow copious thrust through enemies withdrew, thrust again. Sabers flashed in the afternoon sun, severing heads and limbs. The hussars were killing machines in perfect formation, and there was nothing the Ottoman infantry could do to stop them. And before the Ottoman left flank could even begin to respond or regroup, the second line of hussars swept past the first, widening the breach. Then the third line, then the fourth. Wave after wave of armored cavalry, each charge more devastating than the last, each wave exploiting the gaps created by the previous one. Within minutes, not hours, minutes, the entire Ottoman left flank had been annihilated. 10,000 men killed, wounded, or scattered in less than a quarter of an hour. It was complete and utter destruction, but the hussars didn't stop. This was the crucial difference between them and other cavalry. Most cavalry would stop after the initial charge to regroup, becoming vulnerable to counterattack. The hussars maintained momentum. They wheeled inward, their formation still intact, and attacked the Ottoman center from the flank and rear. Panic spread through the Ottoman army like wildfire. Units that had been fighting courageously all day suddenly found themselves attacked from directions they hadn't prepared for. The psychological impact was crushing. They were fighting to the front, fighting to the rear toward Vienna, and now cavalry was crashing into their flanks. The Ottoman center began to shatter. First in small groups, then in entire units, Ottoman soldiers broke and ran. Officers tried to maintain order, but it was futile. The panic was contagious. Men who had been brave warriors minutes before were now desperate to escape, to survive, to get away from those terrifying winged demons cutting through their ranks. Kara Mustafa tried desperately to reorganize his forces. He rode through the chaos shouting orders, trying to rally his troops, trying to establish some kind of defensive line. But it was hopeless. His army was in complete disintegration. The careful formations had dissolved into a terrified mob. He finally gave the order to retreat. But the order came too late. His best units, the Janissaries, the Sipahis, were surrounded and being systematically destroyed. His artillery was being captured. His camp, filled with the treasures he had looted during his march through Hungary, was being overrun by Christian soldiers hungry for revenge and plunder. The battle turned into a slaughter. Ottoman soldiers ran in every direction seeking escape, but there was nowhere to go. Behind them was the Danube, a major river that couldn't be quickly crossed. Ahead and to the sides were enemy forces. The hussars rode through the fleeing Ottoman army like reapers through wheat, cutting down anyone they caught. Some Ottomans tried to surrender. In the chaos, some were accepted as prisoners, but many were simply killed where they stood. After 2 months of watching Vienna suffer, after seeing civilians starve and walls pounded to rubble, the Christian soldiers were in no mood for mercy. By nightfall, the Ottoman army had ceased to exist as a fighting force. What had been 200,000 men in the morning was now a scattered mass of refugees fleeing back toward Hungary. The battlefield was covered with bodies. Contemporary estimates suggested at least 15,000 Ottoman soldiers lay dead, with tens of thousands more wounded or captured. The relief army had lost fewer than 2,000 men. It was one of the most lopsided victories in military history. An army less than half the size of its opponent had achieved total victory in a single afternoon. Inside Vienna, citizens who had endured 2 months of siege emerged from the ruins of their walls. They saw the Ottoman army in full retreat, their camps abandoned, their siege equipment captured. They wept with joy and relief. The nightmare was over. Vienna was saved, and all thanks to a cavalry charge. A secret weapon that had utterly destroyed the largest army the Ottoman Empire had ever assembled. 18,000 Polish hussars had changed the course of history in less than an hour. When the sun set on September 12, 1683, the landscape around Vienna had been transformed into a scene of absolute carnage. The battlefield was littered with bodies stretching for kilometers. Abandoned weapons, broken artillery pieces, and discarded equipment covered the ground. The Ottoman camp, which hours earlier had housed 200,000 men, now stood empty, its treasures being systematically looted by victorious Christian soldiers. The scale of the Ottoman defeat was staggering. Modern historians estimate that at least 15,000 Ottoman soldiers died on the battlefield itself. But that number only tells part of the story. In the days following the battle, as Christian forces pursued the fleeing Ottoman army, tens of thousands more were killed. Many drowned trying to cross rivers in their panicked retreat. Others were cut down by Hungarian irregulars who took revenge for the Ottoman army's brutal march through their territory months earlier. For the relief army, casualties were remarkably light. Fewer than 2,000 men had been killed in the battle. The Austrians and Germans who had engaged the Ottoman center throughout the day had taken the heaviest losses. The Polish cavalry, which had delivered the decisive blow, suffered relatively minimal casualties. Their charge had been so devastating, so overwhelming, that the enemy never had a chance to mount an effective counterattack. The disparity in casualties, roughly 15,000 Ottoman dead versus 2,000 Christian dead, made this one of the most lopsided major battles in European history. It rivaled or exceeded famous one-sided victories like Agincourt or Cannae in terms of the kill ratio achieved. Inside Vienna, the joy was indescribable. Citizens who had been facing slow death by starvation or sudden death from Ottoman mines and artillery now found themselves saved. When Sobieski entered the city the next day, crowds lined the streets weeping and cheering. People reached out to touch him, to touch his horse as if he were a saint rather than a mortal man. The city itself was in ruins. Entire sections of the walls had collapsed. Buildings near the fortifications were destroyed. The scars of 2 months of constant bombardment were visible everywhere. But Vienna had survived. The people had survived. And now they could rebuild. The Ottoman camp proved to be a treasure trove beyond anyone's imagination. Kara Mustafa had indeed been motivated partially by greed, and he had brought with him or accumulated during his march an enormous amount of wealth. There were chests filled with gold and silver coins. There were fine carpets, jeweled weapons, precious manuscripts, and exotic spices. The looters found camels, Arabian horses, and even an ostrich, exotic animals the Ottomans had brought for display. Most significantly for European culture, they found vast quantities of coffee beans. The Ottomans were heavy coffee consumers, and the siege camp had contained supplies for an army that expected to be there for months. Christian soldiers, unfamiliar with coffee, initially didn't know what to make of these strange beans. But enterprising individuals soon recognized their value and claimed them as spoils of war. The artillery captured was equally significant. 300 Ottoman cannons fell into Christian hands, including the massive bombards that had terrorized Vienna. These weapons would be turned against the Ottomans in the wars to come. The military balance of power in Central Europe had shifted dramatically in a single day. For Kara Mustafa personally, the consequences were fatal. He fled the battlefield and managed to escape back to Ottoman territory, but he couldn't escape the Sultan's wrath. Sultan Mehmed IV was furious at the catastrophic defeat. The entire campaign, the largest military effort the Ottoman Empire had mounted in decades, had ended in complete disaster. In December 1683, 3 months after the battle, Kara Mustafa was executed on the Sultan's orders. The method was strangulation with a silk cord, the traditional execution method for high-ranking Ottoman officials. His head was delivered to the Sultan as proof of the deed. His vast personal fortune, accumulated through years of corruption and looting, was confiscated by the state. But Kara Mustafa's death did nothing to reverse the consequences of the defeat. The myth of Ottoman invincibility had been shattered. For generations, European states had viewed the Ottoman military as nearly unstoppable. They had paid tribute to avoid conflict, surrendered cities without fighting, and generally treated Ottoman power with deep respect bordering on fear. Now that fear was broken. Vienna had held. The relief army had won. The Ottoman military machine could be defeated. This psychological shift was as important as the military defeat itself. Within the Ottoman Empire, the failure sparked political unrest. Different factions blamed each other for the disaster. The Janissaries, who had failed to stop the Polish Hussars, were scapegoated. Their privileged position in Ottoman society began to erode. The entire military system came under scrutiny, with reformers arguing that Ottoman tactics and equipment needed to be modernized. For the Habsburg Empire, Vienna's salvation marked the beginning of a golden age. With the Ottoman threat averted, Emperor Leopold could focus on consolidating his power. In the years following the battle, Habsburg forces, often still led by Sobieski and his Polish army, launched a counter-offensive against the Ottomans. Within a few years, all of Hungary was reconquered. The Habsburgs pushed into Transylvania, into Croatia, into the Balkans. Territory that had been under Ottoman control for generations returned to Christian rule. The Habsburg Empire, which had been on the defensive for decades, suddenly became an expanding power. Vienna itself was transformed. From a frontier fortress city constantly under threat, it became the brilliant heart of a secure empire. The magnificent Baroque architecture that Vienna is famous for today, the palaces, the churches, the grand boulevards, was largely built in the century after 1683, financed by the wealth that flowed from newly conquered territories and from a city that no longer had to spend every resource on survival. For John Sobieski, the immediate aftermath brought glory beyond measure. He became a hero throughout Christian Europe. Pope Innocent XI called him the savior of civilization. Songs were written about him. Paintings depicted his charge down Kahlenberg Hill. His name became synonymous with courage and military genius. He sent a message to the Pope shortly after the victory, paraphrasing Julius Caesar's famous words, Veni, vidi, Deus vicit. I came, I saw. God conquered. This phrase captured the spirit of how the victory was perceived, not merely as a military triumph, but as a divine intervention, a sign that God favored the Christian cause. But for Poland as a nation, the long-term consequences were more complicated. Poland had expended enormous resources on the Vienna campaign, mobilizing 30,000 troops, transporting them across Central Europe, supplying them for months. All of this was extraordinarily expensive. And what did Poland receive in return? Glory, certainly. Prestige, absolutely. But territorially and economically, Poland gained almost nothing from the victory. The Habsburgs reconquered Hungary but didn't share it with Poland. The German princes reclaimed their territories, but offered Poland no compensation for its critical role in saving them. Poland had saved Europe but received little tangible reward. This would have devastating long-term consequences. In the decades following Vienna, Poland remained militarily strong but economically weak and politically dysfunctional. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth's unique political system, which gave every nobleman veto power over any legislation, made effective governance nearly impossible. Reforms couldn't be passed. Taxes couldn't be collected efficiently. The state gradually weakened. Meanwhile, Poland's neighbors, Prussia, Austria, and Russia, were modernizing, centralizing, and growing stronger. And these same powers that Poland had helped save at Vienna would eventually turn on their savior. In the late 18th century, they would divide Poland among themselves in a series of partitions, erasing it from the map of Europe for over a century. There's a tragic irony in this. The weapon that saved Europe couldn't save Poland itself. The Hussars could win battles but couldn't solve the deep structural problems of Polish governance. Military glory meant nothing without a stable political and economic foundation. But all of that lay in the future. In September 1683, in the immediate aftermath of the battle, there was only joy, relief, and celebration. Vienna was saved. The Ottoman advance was stopped. Christianity had triumphed over what seemed like impossible odds. And in the center of it all were the Winged Hussars, their armor still stained with blood, their lances broken from use, their horses exhausted but victorious. They had done what no other force could have done. They had turned the tide of history in a single afternoon charge down a hillside.